Hello, this is Mator, the creator of the Ghost Froom, and this is the fourth part of my explanation for the Ghost Froom. In this part, I will be presenting to you the properties of the Ghost and Barrier, and I will also be explaining to you how warp launches work. We left off in the last video with the Ghost and the Barrier. Now, I'm going to just get myself on top of the cliff with the method I presented earlier, which is where the Banshee just pushes you through the barrier. And now, here we go. Ghost and Barrier. Now, this Ghost and Barrier is restricted to the barrier. So essentially, pretty much no matter what you do, you can't get it out of the barrier. This is really nice. It just means that you can't really mess this stunt up, which is very nice. The Ghost can be moved by driving or pushing it. So, like, if I get inside of it right now, I can drive it around, or I could use a Banshee to push it around. The Ghost and Barrier also functions as a cliff exiter. This means that if I exit it, it will eject me off of the cliff and outside of the barrier, which is pretty handy, but it can also be kind of annoying. Now, finally, you have to be careful with a Ghost and Barrier, for if you're not careful at a corner, it can sink down into a seat hang from the barrier, and you don't want this usually because, well, when it's in the barrier by its middle breakpoints, it's a little bit more versatile and useful. Seat breakpoint, it's not so much, it's just kind of annoying. Originally in the video, I thought that I could get the Ghost all the way up onto the cliff, but that was assuming that there was some kind of hole in the barrier that I could push the Ghost through. And for all my searching, I could never find such a hole, and I could never find any way to really force it up onto the cliff. But that's fine, because I did manage to find the Ghost Froom, so that's pretty cool. Anywho, the way that I found the Ghost Froom, I mentioned it in part in my original video, but I'll give a little bit more detail or just a summary again here. Essentially, I had this Ghost and Barrier and I couldn't get on top of the cliff, but I still wanted to do something with it. So I decided that I wanted to get it as far on the cliff as I could, kind of just taking everything to the max, you know? So I set out one day with my friend Manny to get it past this slant right here, which I'll show you real quick. And I couldn't do so with the Banshee because the Banshee barrier is too low, so we had to resort to some kind of launch. We couldn't drive it up it because it was too steep, so we were trying launches. We found that PFRs, essentially any explosive which wasn't directly acting on the Ghost, were highly ineffective. So we switched to trying warp launches. And, since both me and Manny were very good warp launches, we were able to do this, and we found, after a couple of warp launches, that the Ghost can actually float inside of the barrier. And this was a big surprise, and it was really awesome at the time. It was just like, wow, that's pretty cool. And then I just had the goal to make a Ghost float in the barrier as close to the ceiling as I possibly could, and then get on top of it. And that's how it came about. So anyways, I pushed the Ghost down the cliff to this area because this is a section of barrier which is less bumpy than other sections. And this is important because if the barrier is bumpy, then it can be really hard to land on the Ghost when you're doing the launch onto it later. So yeah, that's important, and that's why I made my Ghost Froom in this area. Another reason why I made it in this area is because this whole area right here is walkable, which means that it's really easy to set up a big launch with multiple players. Anywho, I'm now going to get on top of the cliff, and then I'm going to explain to you warp launches, which you're probably very curious about. Warp launches are the key to making a Ghost Froom, and they're also probably one of the least known stunts involved in making a Ghost Froom. Or least known techniques, I should say. Warp launches were discovered back in 2005, 2006, by either Arma or Hertzie. I can't exactly remember. I think it was Arma and Big Grunty Thirst. And essentially, what they found was that lag could, at times, induce warps, which in turn can send vehicles or players flying. And they later found, as well, that plasma grenades that are stuck to people who warp will explode multiple times. And that's how warp launches were discovered. Since then, warp launches have come a long way. So I'm just going to go about explaining that a bit. What are warp launches? Warp launches are lag-based launches, and there are two types: force warp launches and plasma warp launches. Warp launches are unique, difficult, and advanced. You won't see them in the average server, and you probably don't know about them if you haven't been actively stunning in Halo PC. They aren't really possible on Xbox either, so in order to do warp launches, you must understand lag and networking to a certain degree in order to understand them. This is a little diagram. It's supposed to talk about the three causes of lag. It mentions game servers, clients, and the network. This is pretty accurate for some games, but not for all games. Essentially, the main cause for lag is really just distance. It's the number of stations your data has to pass through. But anyways, what is lag? Lag is the delay associated with ping or latency between you and the server. Lag can be due to distance, or more specifically the number of stations your data has to pass through before it can reach the server, limited bandwidth, or poorly coded networking engines. People often confuse packet loss with lag. Lag is fairly constant and thus not all that problematic. It just means you need to lead your shots in most games. Some games take account for lag and make it so you don't have to lead your shots at all, especially modern games. Packet loss is responsible for everything else, so whenever you see someone teleport or something really weird happens in a game and you can't really explain it, people will scream lag. It's not lag, it's packet loss. This is an example of the ping column in Halo. If you hold F1 while in a server in Halo PC, you will see a column which says ping. There will be a whole bunch of numbers for each player. And this is the delay in milliseconds between that player and the server. So lower ping corresponds to less lag or less delay between them and the server, and thus less leading and thus better, easier to play the game. And this is a screenshot of the lag box, which appears in the lower right-hand corner of the screen when you're losing connection to the server. Essentially, whenever information that you're sending to the server doesn't reach the server, the lag box will appear. And that just means that you're lagging out of the server. Packet loss. So packet loss is defined as when one or more packets of data traveling across a computer network fail to reach their destination. Packet loss is distinguished as one of the three main error types encountered in digital communications, the other two being bit error and spurious packets caused due to noise. That's a definition from Wikipedia. Packet loss is usually referred to by gamers as lag, though that isn't really correct, as mentioned before. Packet loss often leads to desynchronizations between the client and the host, like disagreements on some sort of information. This is because essentially if the host doesn't get some information or the client doesn't get some information, then obviously what they think or what the information they have doesn't agree. So a desynchronization will usually be present in that you will see something that isn't actually the case as a client. These desynchronizations are corrected as soon as the client receives updated information regarding the object that has been desynced. So this is a quick little diagram with a client computer and a server through time. So the time axis is downward. So first I'm going to show you a successful data transfer. Client sends some information to the server, and the server sends confirmation or information to the client, and there's no problems. The information gets where it's going, and everyone's happy. Now I'm going to show you the first type of unsuccessful data transfer. Client tries to send some information to the server, but doesn't get there due to packet loss. Thus, no confirmation was received from the server, and the client sends the information again, in some cases. When information is resent and when confirmation packets are sent is specified by the lower-level systems in applications or routers netcode. In the cases where the information isn't resent, desynchronizations occur, as I said before. Unsuccessful data transfer type 2. This is where the client sends their information successfully, but the server fails to send some information. And this doesn't lead to problems as much as the second case, or the case that I just listed before. And this is because the server is constantly sending information. They're always updating the client with new information. So any information that they send that doesn't reach the client is usually fixed very quickly as they send updated information. Now, position desyncs and warps. A position desync is a desynchronization between a client and a server regarding their position. That is, some information regarding the client's movement doesn't reach the server and thus leads to a discrepancy between them and the server regarding where they are. In these cases, the client's information is considered dominant or has priority, and the server thus has to correct the client's position as seen by everyone else on the server. In Halo, this correction is done nearly instantaneously. That is to say, the client pretty much teleports from the incorrect location to the correct location. This correction is called a warp. It's not clear whether players pass through the space between the 2 points when they warp, but it seems that it may very well be the case that they do, else warps wouldn't be as powerful as they are. So, for instance, client 1 says, I'm at 45,133.3. That gets to the server, and the server's like, whoops, I have you at 42,134.2. These are just like coordinates in three-dimensional space. The server corrects it by warping them and sends updated information to the rest of the clients. They get the updated information, and they see the client 1 warp. And that's how a position warp happens. And this is an example clip of a position warp. So I have a friend in a tank here. He's just going to drive forward, and boom, warp. Pretty cool. Forced warp launches. A forced warp launch is a launch caused by warping into a player or vehicle while inside of another vehicle. Forced warp launches function by a very simple mechanic. Essentially, whenever you warp into something, you give that thing your nearly infinite momentum, sending it flying at speeds up to Mach 3. In addition to this, Halo doesn't like it when collision models intersect in ways which aren't clean, like at breakpoints. This in turn leads to a repulsive force which pushes objects which intersect each other out of each other. This force, combined with the transferred momentum from the warping vehicles to the object being warped, is enough to create some of the most powerful launches in Halo. Warp launches. So you can see this screenshot right here. It's a ghost at the crest of a forced warp launch. It's pretty much at the ceiling of Blood Gulch, and it's spinning upside down in this screenshot. And yeah, pretty crazy. This screenshot is after a tank warp launch, which is where a tank warps a tank. And you can see the tank right there. It's pretty far away. It's in the sky. And yeah, pretty cool. This is my first clip of a forced warp launch. So I'm just in a tank here. I'm going to use a before warp into this player, and there he goes. Gets sent flying across the entire map. The reason he doesn't die, of course, is because team kill is off. And there's another force warp. This time I'm driving. Someone's driving into a tank. They warp into me, and here we go. I go spinning, flying across the map, base to base. Pretty cool. Plasma warp launches. Plasma warp launches are warp launches that involve making plasma grenades explode multiple times. They are more complex than forced warp launches. They're not quite as simple to understand. A few facts. When you get stuck with a plasma grenade, or when a plasma grenade gets stuck to your vehicle, the grenade becomes your responsibility. This means that it's your job to send the server information about the grenade, such as its position and when it explodes. Here are two screenshots of plasma warp launches. The first one is where I'm in a Banshee and I am getting warp launched by a plasma grenade. So essentially, the plasma grenade was stuck to me, and then as I reconnected to the server, it exploded a whole bunch of times and sent me flying. You kind of see the beginning of that launch. The second launch, or second screenshot, is when I'm warping someone else. I stuck a plasma grenade to their vehicle, it exploded a whole bunch of times, and you can see there's this big blue streak. That's because the plasma grenade just exploded a whole bunch of times in that short period of time, and so you kind of have this blue streak there when that happened. Okay, now I'm going to present to you a hypothetical situation which should help you understand plasma warp launches. So you're a client in a vehicle, like in this screenshot. That's you. You get stuck with a plasma grenade, like the screenshot. All of a sudden, you get a packet loss spike. Boom. Plasma grenade has exploded. Packet is sent to the server. However, because of packet loss, it doesn't arrive. Thus, you do not receive a confirmation that the packet arrived from the server. Now, the server needs to know that this plasma grenade exploded. This is a high priority data transfer. So you try sending it again. But you still have packet loss, so you still doesn't reach the server, and you still don't receive a confirmation. So you try sending it again. Still doesn't reach the server. You repeat these steps many times.
You send that packet a whole bunch, but it never reaches the server. Then, connection is reestablished between you and the server, and packet loss returns to normal bearable levels. Then, the plasma grenade has exploded packets flood into the server all at once. This is because they were kind of buffered, or they were kind of between you and the server, and then all of a sudden they all get there all at once, and the server gets all of these packets saying that plasma grenade has exploded. So what does the server do? Well, it doesn't make the plasma grenade explode once, or twice, but rather hundreds of times. And there you see that big blue streak, plasma warp launch. Now, an interesting thing to note, the way that this works for a plasma warp launch, to a certain extent this actually happens with forced warp launches too, just with movement instead of plasma grenades exploding. Essentially you send your movement to the server a whole bunch, and then that kind of stacks up and the same thing kind of happens. That's another way that forced warp launches can happen. That's usually what happens with after warps. Two different types of forced warp launches, before and after. Anyways, off subject. Here's a clip of a plasma warp launch. So now that you understand how warp launches work, you probably are wondering how you create them. Well, based upon the theory, just basically everything I just explained to you, any method which creates a substantial amount, enough amount of packet loss between you and the server should work. This gives us the following methods. Unplugging your Ethernet cable. This is what me and most stunners use. Essentially, all that you do is you unplug your Ethernet cable, which is the cable you get your internet through, for a certain period of time, usually less than a second. And in this time, you have 100% packet loss, and thus warp. Yeah, there's not very many problems with this method. You can wear down your Ethernet cable if you do it too much. You can unplug it either from the router or from the back of your computer, whatever's easiest for you. Yeah. You shouldn't lose internet connection as long as you don't unplug it for too long. Then there's the lag switcher button. This is the same thing as unplugging, except for instead of unplugging the cable, you're just stopping the connection inside of it. So it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot nicer, but if you're not really a do-it-yourself person, you're probably just going to end up doing unplugging. And then there's uploading massive files. This is what Big Granny Thirst and Arma and all those people back then were doing to create warp launches. Essentially, by uploading files, you use a whole bunch of bandwidth, and that in turn leads to packet loss. And then there's, of course, just bad internet. This was the kind of thing that Hertzy had and gave him a lot of his warp launches. So if you have like dial-up or something and live on the other side of the world from someone, you can have warp launches that way. And that's it. That's my explanation for warp launches.
So, in order to make a Ghost Froom, we use a plasma warp on a ghost in the barrier. And this works because the ghost can only move in the barrier, so the plasma warp isn't going to move it out of the barrier. It doesn't matter how much force you have involved. This barrier has this ghost trapped. It's not going anywhere, not by sheer force alone. And so, in order to launch it up the barrier, you want to put the plasma grenade directly under the ghost's center of mass. And the ghost center of mass is just about in the middle of the hull. And so you want to put the plasma grenade kind of directly underneath it. Now, when you do this, the explosion of the plasma grenade should hopefully push the ghost up to the ceiling. And that's what happens whenever the warp works. So, once you get the launch to work and once you've launched your ghost to the ceiling, the person in the ghost will exit the ghost, and then, due to the friction in the barrier, as I mentioned before that there was a high amount of friction at the bottom of the ghost. This same friction will act between the ghost and the barrier. It'll slow the ghost down and bring it to a stop, in the sky, hundreds of meters above the map, just floating there. Pretty cool, huh? Of course, this isn't all that simple. There's a few problems with actually doing a plasma warp with a ghost in the barrier. A person can fall out of the ghost really easily when you're trying to throw plasma grenades at them, and if they fall out of the ghost, they usually fall off the cliff as well, which is kind of a pain. It's also very hard to position the plasma grenade perfectly. Essentially, if it's off even by a little bit from the center of mass, the ghost won't move straight up the barrier. It'll probably just move sideways or something, or it won't even move at all. So you have to get that positioning perfect. And as if that wasn't enough, plasma warps are really difficult to time. You have to time it just right so that packet is being sent at just the second when you're about to reestablish connection with the server. Else, Halo will take account for all the lag and just ignore it. And the plasma warp has to be very powerful. This is a huge ascent and it's entirely vertical, so you need a very powerful plasma warp. But after enough tries, you can get it, and the result is a Ghost Froom. And that's it. That is the end of part 4.